Welcome to another episode of our video series of the Philosophical History with Contemporary Critique.
It's wonderful to be here. I have to say, the source material for today was, well, it was really compelling. How are you?
I'm excellent, thank you. You know, spending time with these articles, it felt less like research and more like a philosophical autopsy on a society that is almost perfect.
Almost perfect. That's the key phrase.
Right. We're looking at this profound intersection of physical space, governance, and philosophy.
Yeah.
It's all seen through the lens of this incredibly rationalized Dutch city.
Even down to the street names, like Clayton Street. It's all engineered.
Exactly. And the central question that just jumps off the page is, how deeply does our environment, what the sources call the making, how deeply does it actually shape us, our thoughts, our behavior, our happiness?
And that's the mission today, isn't it? To really distill that central tension. Because the sources present this incredible study in contrasts. You have this place described as almost a paradise.
Paradise, yeah.
I mean, all the basic societal problems seem to be solved. But then you have these high rates of depression, unhappiness, even suicide. It's a staggering contradiction.
So the challenge for you, the listener, is to understand how they built this external serenity, and then why that very serenity seems to create such internal chaos.
Exactly. Before we get to the internal suffering, we have to look at the mechanics of the system itself. How did they get it so right on the outside?
Let's start at the foundation then, governance. The material draws this really sharp line between good and bad governance.
And it's not what you might think. It argues that bad governance isn't about having bad rules.
Yeah.
It's about the absence of rules, or maybe worse, the inability to enforce the rules you have.
That creates something, I think the word they use is key-philic.
Arbitrariness,
Yeah.
It's this corrosive sense of randomness. Imagine living in a system where the law is just a whim.
It would create this constant vulnerability, this background hum of anxiety. The sources describe it so well, the feeling that everyone's head can be chopped off at any moment.
And it's not about strictness, right? It's about unpredictability. It's systemic risk, just embedded in your daily life.
Precisely. And without that stable rule of law, power and money they concentrate. And that brings us to this Dutch city.
Which is overwhelmingly middle class. Its whole success seems to be tied to preventing that concentration.
The analogy the sources use is unforgettable. This idea that being wealthy in a chaotic society is just foolishness.
The Ferrari in Istanbul.
The Ferrari in Istanbul, exactly. It's more than just a cute comparison.
Oh, it's a deep commentary on functionality versus symbolism. You have the symbol of freedom and speed.
A high-performance machine.
But the environment, the meccan, with its potholes and its traffic, it renders that core function completely pointless. You can't go fast. You certainly aren't free.
So your wealth is just. It's performative. It gives you status, but it doesn't give you actual capability.
And that's the difference. In this Dutch city, the legal framework is real. It's robust. It actively works to limit that kind of excessive wealth concentration.
Because they know that a strong middle class is the structure that holds everything together.
They regulate capital to protect the system, to protect their own functionality. It's deeply rational.
And what's amazing is how you can see this rationality in the physical world. The architecture, the Bauhaus, the Mondrian aesthetics.
Right. It's not a trend. These are simple, basic lines designed to remove visual noise, to remove ambiguity.
It's the Enlightenment ideal made real. A simple, transparent world designed for competence. The environment isn't trying to distract you.
No, it's designed to help you build a life that is manageable, predictable. And that predictability, that's the foundation for everything else.
Which brings us right back to that first question.
Yeah.
Does the environment define the person?
And based on this evidence, you have to say yes, unequivocally yes, because it defines your capability. It defines the boundaries of what you believe you can do.
This is where they introduce the idea of yapabilirlik, this sense of can-do-itness.
Yes, this feeling of agency. They cite the Montessori principle, which is such a perfect example. You give a child tools and furniture their size, and what happens?
They gain confidence, the world fits them, it tells them you are capable.
And the story of the visually impaired person is it's so powerful. In one country, they were effectively disabled by the environment. No ramps, no signals.
I've been in it, confined.
Then they moved to a place that's accessible, and suddenly they're independent, self-sufficient. The limitation was never internal, it was engineered by a hostile making.
So now we have to look at the opposite of that, the counterforce, what the sources call the culture of inability or prohibition.
And this is the environment that whispers in your ear from childhood, be careful, you'll get sick. Don't try that, you'll fall.
It creates a deep systemic stress, a culture of dependency. Kids aren't allowed to take risks. The elderly are overprotected.
And you end up with citizens who are just. They're used to relying on authority, even when the infrastructure around them is designed for independence.
This culture is often maintained by fear, right? Through what they call the red card effect.
Yes, you see it in workplaces. A manager punishes one person publicly. It's not really about that one person's mistake.
No, it's a message to everyone else.
Watch your step. The boundaries are arbitrary and we're in control. And that it sucks the oxygen out of the room for everyone. It reduces the space for free action.
It's a strategy that, as the sources suggest, comes from a lack of confidence in the governing body itself. They substitute control for competence.
And that suffocating feeling, that's the bridge to our next point, the difference between living in a loud world and a quiet one.
The noise-to-signal ratio.
Yeah.
In a chaotic environment, the noise is deafening. Traffic, emergencies, unpredictability.
It's so loud you can't hear the signal. You can't hear your own inner voice.
You're constantly distracted. You're running too fast to ever stop and reflect. The chaos is an escape.
Until it stops. The moment life becomes quiet, orderly, predictable, that external noise just vanishes, and the signal of your own existence becomes, well, terrifyingly clear.
That moment of realizing, wait, if I'm not running from the chaos outside, what am I running from on the inside?
And that confrontation leads to one of two kinds of distress. First, the madness of realizing you never actually knew yourself. Or second, maybe worse, the pain of confronting your own mediocrity once the external pressures are gone.
If your whole life was about external validation, a quiet place can feel very empty very quickly.
And this whole psychological drama is set against this fascinating European paradox. We have to remember the history here. This place has WWII bunkers. It's seen occupation, conflict.
That trauma, it feeds into the cultural critique that came out of the post-1968 era.
Right. The dominant cultural mode in Europe since then has been this constant self-criticism, apology. It's a direct response to the perceived failure of Enlightenment rationalism.
The argument being, what did all our science and logic and education get us?
It got us to the Holocaust. It led to industrial-scale murder.
So rationality itself becomes the villain. If cold logic can lead to that, maybe logic is the problem.
And that is the immense risk the sources point to, the danger of throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
If you get rid of the rational foundations of law and justice, what's left?
Only power, the powerful oppressing the weak, because you've dismantled the very framework that allows you to judge and constrain power.
It's a kind of self-sabotaging impulse, then. You try to strengthen your apologies for the past, but in doing so, you weaken the very foundation that allows for that kind of self-critique in the first place.
It's an incredibly precarious position. The ability to critique your own society is maybe the greatest achievement of those liberal ideals. To undermine it is, well, it's a dangerous game.
Shifting gears a bit, but related, the economic structure. The Netherlands is described as this hyper-trader society. They basically wrote the book on commerce.
They absolutely did. They are a global engine of liberal capitalism.
Yeah.
The furnace.
Yet this specific place we're looking at has somehow managed to keep what the sources call savage neoliberalism at bay.
Which is a critical observation. They seem to have contained its most destructive forms locally. They export the savage capitalism, the kind that destroys the middle class, to other places.
And that containment is why their own middle class is still so strong.
Because they actively, rationally regulate capital. It's all part of the same project.
Okay, so
Yeah.
they've solved infrastructure, governance, capital. They built the perfect rational box. So why is everyone so sad inside it? This takes us to the project of happiness.
And we have to start by challenging how we even define happiness. We're sold this idea of happiness as a fleeting, momentary spike.
A compulsive state.
Exactly. The sources argue for something older, more sustainable. True happiness isn't a feeling, it's a project, a lifelong project built on serenity and living in a coherent context.
That sounds much more like Aristotle's eudaimonia. Human flourishing. Living a virtuous life over time, not just chasing a momentary high. It's about being in the right system.
But if the system is right, why do so many people who are outside of it seem to reject it? This brings up that psychological defense mechanism.
The illusion of choosing chaos. You hear it all the time. Oh, I'd go crazy in a place that quiet and orderly. I prefer the chaos of home.
It's not a real preference. It's a coping strategy for powerlessness. When you know you can't escape the disorder, you tell yourself you chose it. You turn a systemic failure into a personal preference.
It's the ultimate cognitive shield.
And we see this external perfection colliding with a crippling internal anxiety when we look at parenting. The sources point to this profound worry in our generation of parents.
It's true. They've spent more time with their kids than maybe any generation in history, thanks to the pandemic and other shifts.
And yet, they are demonstrably the most anxious and fearful parents in history. They project risk onto an environment that is statistically safer than it has ever been.
They create this culture of worry, of prohibition, which is the exact opposite of what the physical safety of their world should allow.
It's a devastating conclusion. The Macan is safe and enabling, but the internal programming is stuck on perpetual risk assessment. That culture of inability we talked about has become completely internalized.
So you pass down the fear, even when the reason for the fear is gone.
Right. The anxiety becomes self-sustaining.
So to pull this all together, we've looked at a society that has created an optimal external structure. Functional rules, strong middle class, rational governance, economic containment.
And that structure radically determines the internal state. It fosters capability, but it also eliminates the noise, forcing this difficult self-confrontation.
It provides everything you would need for a human flourishing for eudaimonia.
And yet, this brings us to the final and maybe the most important failure identified in the sources.
Which is?
That despite solving nearly every logistical and material problem a society can face, this place still struggles profoundly with the fundamental human problem of meaning-making.
Which suggests that maybe the most perfectly rational society can't solve the most fundamental and often irrational human question. Why am I here?
What is the purpose of this perfect life? It's the enduring paradox of the rational utopia. They've built the perfect stage for the human drama, but they can't write the script.
And it leaves you with a very serious thought. If the struggle for survival, for basic functionality is removed, what is left for a person to strive for?
If struggle is what creates meaning, does perfection become a kind of existential void?
That is a thought that will certainly stay with the listener. Thank you for walking us through this incredible contrast, this tension between the functional surface and the deep human struggle underneath.
My pleasure. It really makes you reflect on the relationship between your own environment and your internal state, doesn't it? What noise is protecting you, and what would you hear if it suddenly stopped?
We'll see you next time for more philosophical history and contemporary critique.